Good afternoon, everyone. I can see it's wonderful to have a packed room, and I hope everyone can find a seat for the first session in the Elliott Room for the AI Fringe. I hope you've enjoyed the conversations over in the auditorium up to now. Today, this afternoon, I'm really pleased to welcome the first session that's going to be taking place here. I might just give it a few minutes just to let people come through as well. No worries. So I'm really pleased to welcome the first session here in the Elliott Room, and it's my pleasure to introduce this panel on the particularly pertinent topic of making sure that AI works for the public interest. How do you equip organisations, companies, individuals, policymakers with the right tools and guidance to ensure AI is developed with the broader societal outcomes and the public interest in mind? Well, I'm really pleased that we will hear a little bit about how that might be possible from our wonderful speakers here. So please do join me in welcoming NJ, Kathy, Junayna and Jeni, who will be discussing just that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is NJ, and I am the Special Projects and Operations Lead at Colorintech. At Colorintech, we're really focused on driving DEI in the tech industry. And one of the ways we do that is by shaping conversations like this one today. So I'm really looking forward to moderating our discussion a bit about how making AI in the public interest is one, best for the public good and also society as a whole. So I'd like to start off by maybe going through some introductions, and then we'll get into a presentation and panel discussion as well.
Thank you so much, NJ. I hope everyone can hear me, everyone at the back. My name is Junayna Sheibani, and I'm a product owner and data governance analyst at The Guardian.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dinan Alasad. I'm an AI and data science consultant at Faculty AI.
Hi, I'm Jeni Tennison. I'm founder and executive director at Connected by Data, which is a campaign for communities to have a powerful say over data and AI.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Kathy Peach. I'm the director of the Centre for Collective Intelligence Design at Nesta.
So we'll start today's discussion off with a presentation by Kathy, and that will introduce our topic a bit, and we'll go into some wider discussion afterward.
Great. I would like to start this presentation with a proposition that to make AI in the public interest, you have to involve the public in making AI, and you have to involve the public in governing AI too. So it's become increasingly recognised that public trust and acceptance is going to be absolutely critical to the widespread adoption of AI across society. But the latest polling from DCIT shows that the public has quite mixed views about AI at the moment. So 37% of people here in the UK feel that AI will either have a negative or a very negative impact on society. Now, there's been a big push recently on technical assurance processes as a way of helping to increase the trustworthiness of AI systems. But what these processes can't tell you is whether a particular AI system is actually aligned with public values or not. And while they can quantify risks from specific applications and potentially mitigate some of them, they can't remove all risks from a real-world deployment of an AI tool. And this brings us to the question of who gets to decide what is an acceptable level of risk. Now, we believe what's needed is a social assurance process, a process that involves the public in deciding whether a particular AI tool is actually in the public interest. The public should be able to weigh up the potential benefits of a particular tool against the risks and decide on balance whether those risks are socially acceptable. We believe there should be a label or a certification scheme. Think of a fair trade mark, but for public interest, AI. That would be specifically for high-risk AI systems being used within public services. What you're seeing now is a very early prototype of what the label might look like. And we know public trust depends on three core things. Number one, how good the AI tool is and any specific risks that might be associated with it. Secondly, and probably most importantly, the trustworthiness of the organisation that is deploying the AI. And thirdly, the specific context in which the tool is being used. for what purpose, when, and how. And that's really the key reason why we believe that the public needs to have a voice in assuring specific AI tools and specific use cases. And while wider kind of attitudinal polling on AI is useful, it's not good enough to really help us understand where public interest actually lies. I want to give an example from our work in the humanitarian sector, where we've been trying to encourage the adoption of responsible AI. And this is going to be an example of how you actually can involve a community in assuring and evaluating an AI system that they are likely to be affected by. So we went to Antakya in Turkey. You might remember there was a very big earthquake in Turkey in 2023. And this is one of the communities that was most affected. Now, we went there because we wanted to understand to what extent would communities in that region feel comfortable with humanitarian organisations using an AI tool to assess damage to their properties and their neighbourhoods. This is the tool that we were asking them to evaluate. It's called ADA, and it automates the analysis of damage done by the earthquake. It does this using satellite data and computer vision. So it was developed by the Red Cross, and they'd considered deploying it in Turkey after the earthquake. ADA has lots of benefits, but it also has some limitations. So the data set that ADA was trained on data from 19 different types of disasters, only 2 of which were earthquakes. The data set predominantly came from America and Asia, not from Turkey or the wider region. And ADA does not explain how it has reached its conclusions. So to allow the community in Antakya to evaluate the tool, we designed and carried out 2 deliberative workshops with 24 diverse members of the community. We created videos to translate the really complex technical information about the AI tool and its risks into bite-sized, accessible video content, obviously all in Turkish. The groups were supported to discuss and share their opinions by an expert facilitator, and they also had access to an AI expert whom they could question. We used our own deliberative polling platform, the tablets that you can see on the screen, to gauge people's reactions and to understand how their opinions and views started shifting over the course of the conversation and as they learnt more and discussed the tool together. This is broadly the structure of the session. Started with a very brief introduction to AI to ground people's knowledge, then introduced current damage assessment methods before introducing the ADA tool and its benefits, then exploring some of the risks and limitations, some of the safety measures that could be introduced before a final discussion and final polling on how comfortable the community felt about the tool being used in their area. So I'm only going to give a couple of the highlights from the findings. This was a question that we asked continually throughout the session. How do you feel about the tool being used in your area? You can see that people start off really positive about it, but as they learn more about the risks, that positivity decreases. However, as they learn about the potential safety measures that could be introduced, their support increases again, which I think is really good news for anyone who cares about trying to introduce AI in a responsible and safe way. We obviously captured lots of qualitative insights from the deliberations as well. And I wanted to highlight this because I think it's one of the really important things that we forget to remember when we're thinking about asking the public about the social acceptability of AI tools. The public already has a baseline in mind, and it's not an idealized perfect AI tool, it's how things are currently done. It's the status quo. It's how services are currently delivered. And you can see from this quote, we waited a long time for everything, search and rescue operations, building damage assessments. People were frustrated with how humanitarian operations were currently carried out, so they were actually quite open to the idea that an AI tool might help speed up the rate at which they receive support. Now, despite being quite positive about the tool, people also wanted to see safeguards put in place. And the number one safeguard that the group wanted to see was to have staff trained on the AI tool. And then secondly, to make sure that the impact of the tool was regularly monitored and evaluated. Now, we often hear from technologists and sometimes from people in government too that the public really doesn't want to get involved in these conversations, that they're happy to leave it to the experts. We really disagree, and actually so did our group members in Antakya. So 92% felt like people like them should be involved in decision-making on AI. As the government has said, we do now have a unique opportunity to demonstrate the use of AI in line with public values and to demonstrate and role model the responsible use of AI. We agree. We think one of the keys to being able to do this well is to introduce social assurance processes like our proposed AI Social Readiness Advisory Label. We're going to be trialling this approach here in the UK over the course of this year. But just to emphasise, although I've talked about one way that you can involve the public in evaluating and assuring AI systems, there are lots of other ways that you can meaningfully involve the public, from early upstream in the model development right the way through to auditing AI systems. In 2021, we published a paper called Participatory AI for Humanitarian Innovation. It set out a range of ways you can do this. But in the last couple of years, there's been a real explosion in experimentation with lots of different approaches, and there's been many more ideas that have been developed, and hopefully we're going to talk about some of those on the panel discussion now. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Kathy. That was really helpful in shaping our broader conversation on what exactly public interest is and maybe how the public can interact with AI. So it'd be good to hear maybe some initial thoughts from our panelists, some reactions to the presentation itself.
I can start. I think coming from a governance background, I don't know if people noticed how much I was nodding. I think a lot of what you said resonated with me, especially because, in terms of considering the public interest, it's really important that initially we undertake risk assessment and understand what are the mitigating risks, especially with regards to, I think more generative AI and general use AI, and how this can affect public good. And we've seen it as well, with things like deep fakes and, the romantic AI chatbots where they're, completely going against everything to do with data privacy. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting tool, and I really appreciated everything that you've presented. So it's lovely. Mm.
Great. I think that's a really good way for us to jump into our maybe next conversation. Kathy, in the presentation, you focused on one specific way that you could involve communities in the work that can be done on AI policy, which was the deliberative workshops. It'd be good to hear from maybe some of your other sectors on how that could look as well. So how exactly do we involve communities in conversations about AI policymaking?
So I'd be happy to jump in with a few kind of other examples. So I think guiding the development of particular AI systems is obviously really important to get the people who are going to be affected by them involved from a very early stage, because it helps to make sure that the tool works better and works in the way that they want it to. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is what the downstream stuff looks like, in particular when people haven't been engaged early on, and what kinds of powers and rights people need to have in order to have their say later on in the process, and in particular as the kind of impacts and implications of the use of AI kind of come to the fore. So what are the kind of community audits that can be done after a tool has been deployed, or how, for example, we've been working a lot with unions and workers, how can people in the workplace really understand what impact the new technologies that have been introduced in the workplace are having on them as workers, as a collective, so that they can push back against it and have the power to do so in a kind of collective way. So I think that deliberative panels like these are obviously very useful and very powerful, especially when you can get people in the room who are going to also help to present the panels with different kinds of points of view. So, you know, the ones that are going to have the privacy expert on one side and somebody who's really, really pro-AI on the other side, and be able to really stoke the conversation, because it needs to be a kind of a political conversation many times about what's right and not. We also need that kind of power further down the stream of AI as well.
I think it's really important to equip the public with enough information to make an informed decision. And so it's not just about including their opinion, but also making sure that they have enough information. And I think particularly with AI, people are very intimidated by it as a concept. And I think it's because we keep using this blanket term, but it really is just a new technology. A technology that has many functions. And when we don't have the conversation about those specific functions separately, it becomes this thing that, you know, stands on each other's shoulders and becomes very intimidating for people. But at the end of the day, AI is a technology that is an extension of technologies that we've had for a long time. And the concept, the principle of delegating a human task to a machine is something we've been doing since quite literally the invention of the wheel, you know? And I think when we start the conversation there, when we remind people that this is an extension of something that has always happened rather than this new sensation that is coming and taking over, they're able to understand it a little bit better. Because truly it's not anything brand new, it's a new combination of a lot of technologies that have already existed. And I think approaching the conversation in that way makes it a lot more accessible and allows people to understand it and be less afraid of it, which I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, obviously as a governance person, this is what's going to guide how I speak about this. Transparency, I think, is really important. I think there's been a lack of transparency from companies that the companies that actually create the AI. And I think governments need to kind of sort of egg this transparency conversation on. And I think it's really important for these companies to not only kind of like involve the government in terms of like how they're propelling this transparency forward and like how these, you know, this can guide policy, but also in general, I think for governments to sort of create initiatives like, I don't know who mentioned unions, to create initiatives, just to piggyback off Dinan's point about, you know, involving the public and not making it seem like such a scary thing, and ensuring that this is something that should be for everybody. Because even if you look at it from a global perspective, I think a lot of countries are behind, and at the moment I think it's the US, China, the UK, and, you know, certain European countries that are guiding this conversation forward with regards to AI. So in order for this to be something where everyone's on a level playing field, this information needs to be made accessible. You know, reports need to be published, and throughout the process of building this AI, these technologies need to be made clear, I think, essentially to the public, and, you know, for this to be accessible so that people can know what they're dealing with, so that the policies can reflect what's being built in the technologies as well.
I think we often hear a lot of emphasis on how do we upskill the public, how do we educate the public so they can take part in these discussions. And actually, I don't think the onus should be on the public to be upskilled or to educate themselves. It's such a fast moving area, it's impossible for people, even whose day jobs it is, to keep track of all the developments. I think the onus needs to be on technology companies and on policymakers to upskill themselves and to develop their tools so they can actually engage the public meaningfully. But having said that, I think we also need to be really mindful of the risk of participation washing. So we know that some of the big tech companies, like OpenAI, for example, like Anthropic, others, are starting to use participatory methods. I think the real question is, to what extent is the input that they are collecting from the public actually really being used to inform model development, and to ensure that actually the models are doing the things that the public wants them to do and not doing the things that the public doesn't want them to do. At the moment, it's fairly opaque, I would say.
No, definitely. It sounds like this conversation is moving a little bit less from what the public needs and maybe what private policy maybe needs to be doing as well. So what are some of those challenges in bringing in things like governments, organizations, private and public? What are the conversations we need to be having about how we can make AI more equitable from both sides?
I think there's something to be said about, the data that's being fed into the systems. And I think I've said this before, whatever we're feeding in is, the responsibility of the human beings. And whatever's been fed out is, I think, what happens as a result of whatever the AI systems are doing. So I think in general, it's the responsibility of whoever is building the tech to ensure that it's coming from an equitable place, to ensure that, things like people being wrongly recognized and, with facial recognition and, having issues with that. I think people have heard of that before, if you're on top of the AI issues that have occurred. I think that's really important to ensure.
Yeah. I think a challenge that, just to piggyback off of what Junayna said, I think a challenge that I'm seeing rear its head more and more is the fact that historically the sciences and the social sciences have existed so separately. Mm-hmm. The world has been very, very siloed in terms of these disciplines, but now technology is interacting with humans in a way that it never has before. So it's really, really important to incorporate that knowledge and the ability to assess things like ethics, for example, when you are building these models, when we're having these conversations. I think there's this belief that STEM or science and mathematics are apolitical and they exist separately and they're very exact and objective, but that's not the case anymore. I don't think it's ever been the case, but that's a personal opinion. I think it's increasingly difficult to deny that they're actually not objective and they're not apolitical. And the scientists who are building this tech a lot of the time do not have the frameworks or the language to do these ethical assessments that we need. I think as we move forward, these curriculums that teach people things like computer science and engineering and so on need to have embedded within them the ability to assess the risk and the social risk and the risk to the most vulnerable people in society, the societal risk of the technology that we're building, because right now it's not that they are deliberately being malicious, it's just that they do not know how to perform these risks. And I think we rely on the law so much, but technology is moving so fast that there's a personal responsibility, I think, to perform our own ethical assessments of things that may be permissible by law or the law still hasn't caught up to. And I think multidisciplinary conversations are needed now more than ever before.
Yeah. Kathy, Jenny, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I really agree with the imperative on the developers and the deployers and designers of technology and AI to be as inclusive as possible, to bring people into the conversation and to try and strive to develop ethical technologies. I think we have to recognise that doesn't always happen as well. And so as well as the pressure that we should be putting on organisations to do that and to invite people in, we also, from a policy perspective, need to have the mechanisms for people who haven't been invited in to be able to have a powerful say over technology. And that's where things like rights frameworks or powers to unions or other mechanisms for actual accountability are really, really essential. And I would also draw real attention to the need for strong civil society organisations who can do organisation, who can bring people together so that they are not just individual voices in a big cloud, but are actually purposeful and can really make their voice heard. So I think that at the same time as we really strive for the kind of excellent ethical frameworks and getting the organisations themselves to invite people in, we also need to be empowering civil society and to be able to push themselves in when they're not invited and to be able to have power in that context.
I think there are two big issues that need to be addressed. So first, if we look at the trajectory of AI at the moment, it's mostly about the monopolisation of the technology amongst a small number of very big, very rich companies. That, I think, is obviously not a good trajectory for the equitable use of AI, there has been a very big theme emerging from the AI Action Summit around open source AI. And I think that is absolutely something where we need to see much more policy action, much more public investment in the creation of digital public goods, everything from open data sets, open models, open hardware, open software. We know that that will enable communities and countries who don't currently have the resources to take advantage of AI to really be able to adapt and localize and use them for their specific needs. So I think that's for me, one of the really key priorities. I think the second key priority is around language. So there are 7,000 languages spoken in the world. And I think the digital world really is based around 19 of those languages. So there are 3.7 billion people who do not speak any of the major languages who are currently excluded from a lot of digital and AI developments. Now, we know it's not in the commercial interests of these big companies to build AI systems that work for people who don't speak major languages or who maybe are not particularly or have low levels of literacy. This, again, I think is another key area where we need to see much more policy action and much more public investment.
Absolutely. I think that kind of goes to my next point in what do we think of when we talk about the public goods. You brought that up, Kathy, recently, and I think it's important for us to define it for ourselves personally and also to maybe define how it could look, specifically like making sure that we have accessible language for those who might want to access AI as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think when we talk about the public good, for me, the word that comes up in my mind is equity. I think the public good is something that can be defined by, everyone having access. I think with regards to, if we're speaking about AI, everyone to have access to the same technology, and for there to be a baseline on this. I really, really like the fact that you brought the statistic up about how many languages are spoken all over the world, 7,000 or maybe even more than that, including different tribal languages, and then the languages that the technologies are being created in. So there's a huge disparity there. I think digital exclusion is a huge issue. I think even here in London, in the capital city, I used to work on digital exclusion projects for communities that are, I don't know what the word I can say is, but maybe underserved. And even here in this gorgeous bustling city that's in a higher economically developed sort of region of the world, we still face these issues. So I think it's more about that inclusion, but in a very multidisciplinary way. So kind of including not only economic inclusion, but also racial inclusion, ensuring that all of these different people's perspectives are included, but not in a performative way, but in a genuine way that will reflect in the technologies that are being brought out. So yeah, I don't know, I could say a lot about this. I don't know. What do you think, Dinan?
I absolutely agree. I think specifically the fact that the inclusion needs to not be performative.
Yeah.
I think when we speak about diversity, a lot of the time there's a lot of tokenization, but we really need it for very, very real and tangible reasons. So like Junayna, I work in London, and I work in the field of AI, and I work specifically in the field of public services. But I'm from Sudan, and I grew up in Sudan. And through the past few years, social media has changed a lot. And I've been able to see firsthand how timelines and social media feeds, going from chronological to having these personalized feeds that are based on, these algorithmic intervention that shows up as, the most interesting posts first or whatever. For our community that uses social media for mutual aid, for example, that's been incredibly important. As people from a country that has that had hyper-surveillance and not a lot of media freedom, we used social media to amplify the truth and tell our stories and communicate to each other. And I lose, I think, a lot of sleep sometimes about this, thinking about how this is such a niche experience and it's such a niche impact of AI that is very particular to my community, and how many communities there are and how many impacts that we're not factoring into these technologies. Because I don't imagine people developing those tools it ever crossed their minds. Again, as I said earlier, it's not deliberately malicious, but it is incredibly underinformed. And I echo your point, Jeni, about how it's important for us not to just get more voices in the room, but also make sure that the voices that are not in the room are included. Not everyone has an interest in AI development, and that's fine, but soon everyone will be impacted by AI development. And it's really important to have the frameworks and tools and policy to be able to factor in the experiences of people who may not necessarily even want to be in the room, but will be impacted. I think that is our responsibility, and it is something that we need to be thinking about and implementing. Over to you, Jeni.
So questions about public good, I think it's very, very difficult. While I personally agree with a lot of what you've been talking about, I think it's very difficult to have conversations about public good in this kind of abstract way that we might set some particular guards around technology from that perspective. And we also really need to recognize that there are lots of different people in the world that have very different conceptions of what public good is, right? You listen to J.D. Vance's speech at the summit earlier today, and obviously for him, public good is about free speech and about innovation overall, right? Rather than about he would never say the word equity or inclusion or diversity. These are banned words in the free speech America. Anyway, must not rant on this. But my point is that these are the what is public good. Really, everybody thinks that they are operating in public good, but they have very, very different conceptions about what public good is. That's one of the reasons why I think that getting down to the individual tools and like the individual impacts is actually a more helpful conversation, because it means that you can actually ground things, the conversation in how do we want this thing to operate in this context for these people right here, and having those people involved in that conversation for what is good for them, I think is the most essential piece of how we move forward. So for me, then defining the very large scale things, while I could also kind of really align with those kinds of values, I think when we're looking at AI governance, we need to get down to the specifics in order to see what good means at those very context-driven places.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if people are familiar with an experiment that was done by MIT called the Moral Machine, like several years ago now, where they crowdsourced, I think, something like 40 million people's views on the kind of classic trolley problem, but applied to autonomous vehicles. So in a scenario where you should either kill, say, 2 children and an old lady or 3 working age adults, which would you choose? Yeah. And what they found was that maybe not surprisingly, people in different cultural contexts placed different values, had different values. So I think this speaks to the challenge of there probably is no one single common definition of public good. One thing I would say from my perspective, because I work in a thing called the Centre for Collective Intelligence, is I do think we're building the wrong kind of AI at the moment, and I wish we would invest much more in building AI that actually helped us as groups of people collaborate better together, think better together, understand problems better together, decide and act together, because I think that's what we actually need to solve the big problems that we're facing right now, not least climate change, instead of really having all of the investment go into commercial and military applications of AI.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if I can make a point on what you just said. I really liked the conversation around kind of funneling resources with regards to building AI more into solving problems collectively, especially with regards to climate change. I hope this isn't controversial to say, I really hope it wouldn't be in this room, but surely, you know, us protecting ourselves against climate change is definitely public good for every single person sitting in this room, rather than investing into military technologies. I don't know, that's just a personal perspective. But yeah, I really think that that's a really good baseline to start off with, to start off by thinking about the fact that, you know, this world that we're living in is actually being desecrated, unfortunately, by generative AI technologies. I don't know the exact statistics off the top of my head, sorry guys, but I do know that there's a lot of water that's passing into data centers that's required for just one search on ChatGPT and OpenAI, and I think that's really unfortunate. So I think, the people need to think. People need to use their brains, and I think ChatGPT sometimes can be the antithesis of that, unfortunately. So, in my opinion, there's two things that have come out of what you've said that are resonating with me. One, that collective kind of that collective sort of feel of kind of solving problems together, and then also the point about, I think there's a lack of critical thinking, and there's like a kind of like a rise in depending too much on generative AI, and I think that is particularly dangerous because we need to be able to exercise that muscle as much as possible, especially right now in really contentious times. I'm not going to say too much more, but yeah.
There's a lot to be said, yeah.
I'm glad you raised the point about sustainability though, because it's probably been a bit of an elephant in the room in this conversation so far. But I think also, again, where's the investment going? It's going into really big models that require really big data sets and really big compute. And actually, maybe you don't need really big models. Actually, why aren't we investing more in building smaller models that solve discrete problems? You can probably manage some of the risks and the privacy concerns with those a lot better. And that's another way that we can start to have much more diversification and perhaps more equitable development and use of AI as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really valid point that a lot of people maybe possibly in this room might also agree with, is that sometimes when you have all this regulation, it kind of gets in the way, quote unquote, of innovation. And it'd be good for us to speak about that as a challenge instead of a barrier. So how do we combat that challenge? How do we get governments, institutions, and communities to work together to make AI really in the public interest while also driving innovation?
I think right now the public sector has an incentive to innovate, as they always do, and the incentive is profit. And I don't think they're thinking about the long-term impact of a lot of the decisions that they're making, a lot of these huge models that they're building, a lot of these companies that are monopolizing or starting to monopolize AI technologies. I think it's really, really important to invest in research about what will happen long-term. Right now we're having this rise of chatbots. What is going to happen when we were speaking about this earlier, when the skill of customer services becomes obsolete because every time you call any hotline, you're on the phone with a robot for 10 minutes before you can speak to a real person, if you get to speak to a real person. But that's just a small example, but what about the environmental impacts of, we're doing, I think, a lot of over-engineering. And a lot of these machines that we're building, we're not doing a very basic cost-benefit analysis, because at the end of the day, AI is a tool. In the same way that an airplane is a tool, for example. If an airplane is used to get aid to a country that needs it very, very quickly, that is a good use of that airplane. If the airplane is used to transport one very rich person across the globe, not so much. So we really need to be thinking about the cost and the benefit of the tools that we're building. We really need to be factoring in the environmental impact of AI. I think that is something that people are shocked when they hear about. I was speaking to my grandmother actually yesterday. She had no clue that there's a cost to the GPT searches, and when people make those videos with like all those strange videos that people are making using AI. And I think there are very noble and very good uses for AI still. I'm not someone who will demonize it for the sake of demonizing it. Some of the work that we do at faculty that I'm very, very proud of is the work that we've done in combating rough sleeping and homelessness, for example, work that we did with the London Office for Technology and Innovation. I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI to help in healthcare, in public services. There's backlogs everywhere. And like you mentioned in your presentation, a lot of people are very frustrated with the status quo. And that's something that we can do that can help the public in a very direct way. And there will be humans in the loop, humans who are able to supervise the impact and oversee the work being done. So I think, to summarize everything that I said, I think it's really important to invest in researching what the long-term impacts of the work that we're doing are going to be, and the machines that we're building. And it's really, really important to go back to the absolute basics and do a very basic cost-benefit analysis. Like Jeni said, people need to think, I think. Yeah, people need to think.
Anti-intellectualism is on the rise, I think, with the ChatGPT reliance.
I don't know when we bought the line collectively that regulation is a bad thing for innovation, because actually you use regulation to direct the type of innovation that you want and to create the type of societies that are desirable. And I think it's really concerning that we're seeing a rollback against regulation on AI, I mean, literally everywhere. It's very, very worrying. And surely, have we not learned from the last few years where we've had a succession of regulatory failures, from the 2008 financial crisis through to the privatised water companies pumping sewage into our rivers and seas? Do we want to have regulatory failures on AI as well or not?
And I think that's, that general kind of conception that regulation holds things back is also comes into play when we look at the public being involved in this, because as soon as you introduce the idea that the public should have a say, organisations get worried that they're going to hold stuff back, that it's going to take a long time, that it's going to be costly. But the way I look on it is that it's by involving people, especially early on in the process, is how you can make sure that the tool gets used, that it actually works as intended, and so that you don't have the great amount of kind of waste of developing something that later you get huge pushback on. And also, when people feel in control of the process and feel in control of being able to whether a tool gets adopted or not, or how it gets adopted, then they're much more likely to adopt it, which is what we need in order to get to the kinds of benefits that people talk about from AI in terms of productivity and so on. So I really agree with your point around regulation not being an issue, but I also think that public involvement is not actually an issue over the long term. And if you look at the kind of bigger consequences, then I think it's really essential.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your time today. As we come to a close, it would be great to hear some last remarks or just maybe some key takeaways from our conversation today.
I don't want to start. I'm struggling to start.
I think I found the presentation to be very, very interesting, and I think we've become very accustomed to large volumes of data when we look at research. And I was looking at the sample sizes. Sometimes you really just need to speak to the 24 people who are going to be, or a sample of 24 people from the community that's going to be impacted by building something. And again, that's only something that you can do if you're building these models for a purpose, building for purpose rather than building for, this widespread commercial objective. And I think we need more of these. We need more focus groups. We need to be consulting the people and explaining to them what we're going to be doing. And I think a lot of people now think of that as optional, and as you said, they're just like, we don't want this to be slowed down, and they perceive that to be an obstacle. One, there is a very real risk that you will invest a lot of money in building something, regulation is going to catch up, and you're not going to be able to use it. And I hate to fearmonger, but I think it's a pretty good tactic in getting people to invest in doing that kind of pre-built thinking about the long-term impacts of the things that they're investing in and that they're building. And I think that's definitely something I'm going to be thinking about more and trying to place in the context of the work that I do. So thank you.
Great. Any other final remarks?
I would just like to say thanks to Colorintech and the organisers of AI Fringe for having an all-female panel. If you... If you look, I think it's actually really rare, because if you look at who's dominating the public conversation about AI, it's white men. Okay, it's white, rich men. And perhaps that is part of the problem. I think we need to hear from some of the godmothers of AI, not just the godfathers.
I love that.
So, and perhaps that will shape some of the conversations we're having about actually what is public interest, AI or not.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for closing with that. We might have time for one question from the audience, possibly. I saw this hand shoot up instantly, so I'll go ahead and give it to this sir here.
Thank you very much. Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for the discussion. I wanted to ask, what's your advice in regards to kind of focusing on equitable AI when there's this new kind of trend away from DEI, especially from America? And I'll give you an example. I focus a lot on digital inclusion for disabled people.
Yeah.
And one of the discussions that we've been having is, rather than using the word inclusion now, which is kind of banned, to reframe it and actually just say it's a technical issue. And we're solving a technical issue. Why build products and services accessible for 80%? We can actually build them for 100%. So I just wanted to get your advice in regards to the new kind of trend that's happened with DEI. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a comment on that. I don't need the... I have a comment on that. I think it's such a valuable question, so thank you so much, first of all, for asking it. AI, and I think specifically generative AI in my experience, I can only speak from my experience, is creating silos in how we operate, not only in the workplace, but also in our personal lives. So first of all, I think it's important to go back to the basics and go back to the roots of organizing as a community. There's loads of different, people and different people from different backgrounds that are talented in the space of AI. So seeking those kinds of people out and not living in that vacuum of, these are the kinds of people that are, trying to sort of circumvent the whole DEI conversation and the equality conversation and how far we've come with that. So I think creating those spaces and coming to these spaces where these questions can be asked out loud is really important. But yeah, I think overall just community building and kind of bringing those actions forward with regards to, where we are right now with regards to this and what can be done and how we can move forward with it. I hope that slightly answers your question. I don't know if anyone else has a point.
And I think, I'll just add to that. And I think the reframe of inclusion as a technical issue is really crucial, because I think a lot of developers think of inclusion as a favor they're doing us. But if the technology that you're building for public use doesn't work for people, it's not working, And I think about this, for example, with motion sensors and things like that don't work for people with darker skin. That means it just doesn't work. I don't think that means it doesn't work for people with darker skin. I think it just doesn't do what it needs to do. And recently I was on one of those video calling applications. I'm not going to call them out specifically, but the green screen did not detect my hair, so it just detected my face from here. And that just means that it doesn't work, because I only have the context of my experience. So if a technology doesn't work for people of color, if it doesn't work for disabled people, that means it just does not work. And I think we need to frame lack of inclusion as incompetence, because that is what it is. The same way we look at anything that just doesn't work in different contexts. If something does not work in different contexts, it means it's not built to do what it needs to do. And I think we really, really need to step away from thinking of inclusion as some kind of favor that is being done. By including our voices in the room, you're doing us a favor. I think by including the various diverse perspectives into a conversation that is about the public inherently, I would like to think that we're doing the conversation a favor by being in it. So thank you for that reframe. I think it's a very important way to think of it.
Yeah, great.
Last thoughts? Just add one final thing, which is that while I really recognise, and I think it's a very useful reframe, I really recognise the need to say things differently for different audiences, and that is very important. It is equally important that we continue to stand up for diversity, equity, and inclusion for their own sake, and not be frightened to say those words, and to value those things. And so, I see this kind of newspeak thing happening in the way in which we're talking about technology, and we're being forced to talk about technology, and I don't think we should be bullied into that.
Yeah, great. Thank you again so much to all my speakers for their thoughts. Thank you to the audience as well.